Habakkuk chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. The oracle of Habakkuk the prophet saw. Lord, how long will I call for help and you not listen? I cry out to you violence, but you don't deliver us. Why do you show me injustice and look at anguish so that devastation and violence are before me? There is strife and conflicts abound. The instruction is ineffective. Justice does not endure because the wicked surround the righteous. Justice becomes warped. Look around the nations and watch. Be astonished and stare because something is happening in your days that you wouldn't believe even if I told. I'm about to rouse the Chaldeans, that bitter and impetuous nation which travels throughout the earth to possess dwelling places it does not own. The Chaldean is dreadful and fearful. He makes his own justice and dignity. His horses are faster than leopards. They are quicker than wolves of the evening. His horsemen charge forward. His horsemen come from afar. They fly in to devour swiftly, like an eagle. They come for violence, the horde with all their faces set towards the desert. They take captives like sand. They make fun of kings. Rulers are ridiculous to him. He laughs at every fortress, then he piles up dirt and takes it. He passes through like the wind and invades, but he will be held guilty, the one whose strength is his God. Lord, aren't you the ancient, my God, my Holy One? Don't let us die. Lord, you put the Chaldean here for judgment. Rock, you established him as a rebuke. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You are unable to look at disaster. Why would you look at the treacherous or keep silent when the wicked swallows one who is more righteous? You made humans like the fish of the sea, like creeping things, with no one to rule over them. The Chaldean brings all of them up with a fishhook. He drags them away with a net. He collects them in his fishing net. And then he rejoices and celebrates. Therefore he sacrifices to his net. He burns incense to his fishing nets, because due to them his portion grows fat and his food becomes luxurious. Should he continue to empty his net and continue to slay nations without sparing them? Do you remember the Verizon wireless commercial from several years ago with a man who would be in various places with his cell phone? He would be on his phone and would say to the unknown person at the other end of the call, "Can you hear me now?" Verizon was attempting to demonstrate that there was no place that a subscriber to their service would not have cell service. And it seems that people are attached to their cell phones 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you hit the talk button on your cell phone, you expect to have service and to be able to talk to the person that you're calling. You ever called someone only to have your call go straight to voicemail? How about getting a message that the voicemail hasn't been set up for the phone? My daughter called me this past week and while we were out for lunch, so I just clicked on the ignore call option, and she texted me a few minutes later and asked me why I was ignoring her. We both kind of had a good laugh about it. Have you ever felt like when you prayed that God was not listening, that he was ignoring you? How do you survive life when it feels like God is not listening? Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like your prayers go no higher than the ceiling? People from every generation have experienced that feeling that God is there, but he's just not listening when they pray. I've gone through some seasons of my life that it's just felt like I was all alone, that God had stopped listening to me. The times that I've experienced this feeling were when it seemed that life around me was just falling apart. And it was during those times that I needed to know that God was there for me. When I read this passage from Habakkuk, I get the feeling that he's at that place where he's wondering if God is even listening to him. I can visualize in my mind Habakkuk saying to God, "Life's a wreck. Can you hear me?" Habakkuk looks around his nation and he cries out to God that life is just a wreck. He describes his society in those first 4 verses using the terms of violence and injustice, devastation, strife, and conflict. Habakkuk has looked at his society and he raises the age-old question of why do good people suffer while evil is running rampant? Where is God in all of that? Evil seems to have the upper hand and the righteous are suffering as a result. I reflected on this and it seems to be the exact way that our world is today. We just pause to remember the September 11th attack by those forces of evil. Many good people died that horrific day, and it served as a wake-up call about the evil that's in our world. Nearly every day on the news we hear about the violent crime that seems to be rampant in our society. We learn about a police officer sitting in their patrol car that is ambushed and shot and killed. We learn about a husband who viciously murders his wife and children. We learn about a child that's been severely abused at the hands of a parent. We learn about women who are abused by men in power positions over them. Nearly every day we read or we hear stories and we wonder, where is God in all of this? And we cry out, God, are you listening? Can you hear me? We can bring it even closer to home when we personally feel the effects of the injustice and violence and evil in our world. Right now in our small congregation, we have 5 families that are currently dealing with or have dealt with the effects of addiction on their family. I learned just this week of a family who lost the son due to the effects of alcohol addiction. A young man who had a future ahead of himself, but the addiction damaged his body so much so that he was beyond the help of doctors. We've witnessed sons and daughters spending time in jail because of their addictions. In the midst of the devastating effects of addiction, we cry out to God to see if he even takes notice of what's happening in our lives. We cry out to God asking, can you hear us? And that's where Habakkuk is. He's at the point of crying out to God because of all the evil that is happening around and asking God, can you hear me? Have you been there? Are you there today? Habakkuk, though, doesn't leave us in despair, feeling that life sucks and then you die. God's listening even in those times when it feels like he's not. God responds to Habakkuk's cry, and he replies to him, I've got this handled. Can you hear me? Habakkuk's nation, Judah, it's really been on a roller coaster ride of a relationship with God over the course of their history, dating clear back to King David. There had been times when they had walked in obedience to God, and there were times when they were far away from God. This was one of those times when they were not walking in obedience with God. It really is astounding because not much more than 12 years prior, Judah had experienced a great revival under the leadership of King Josiah. And after his death, the people quickly walked away from God. God's heard Habakkuk's complaint, and he says, I've got this handled. He tells him to look, be astonished, to stare. God tells him that Habakkuk is going to be amazed at what he's going to do because all of the evil and the injustice in the nation. And God tells Habakkuk that he's going to use the enemy, the godless Babylonians, as his tool to bring judgment on Judah. For the Judeans, the Babylonians were the personification of evil, and God was saying to Habakkuk that he was going to use them to bring judgment on them because of their evil. God says to Habakkuk, can you hear me? And Habakkuk replies to God and says to him, yeah, but can you hear me? I can imagine Habakkuk thinking that this is just a step too far for God. How could he use evil people to bring judgment upon God's special people? Have you ever had to correct a child or perhaps a teenager for some bad behavior? Teens in particular are good at saying, yeah, but, as they try to argue why they shouldn't be punished. And I can almost hear Habakkuk saying, yeah, but. There's an assurance in Habakkuk's response to God because he calls God, my Holy One, and my rock. Even though he disagrees with the direction that God is taking, he even puts up an argument why God should not use the Babylonians, but he firmly places his faith in God. Habakkuk refers to God as my rock, and when I think of a rock, I think of something that's solid, in many cases unmovable. It's something that's going to last. When Jesus was asking the disciples who people were saying that he was, he asked Peter who he believed he was, and Matthew records these words. Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied to Peter and told him, on this rock I will build my church, Jesus, God himself is the rock. He's the one that we can put our faith in, even when it seems like the world around us is crashing. Habakkuk says to God, can you hear me? We say to God, can you hear me? We feel like God sometimes is not listening. How do I survive life when it feels like God's not listening to me? But God gently says to us, can you hear me? I'm right here. There is a lot of violence and injustice, devastation, strife, and conflict in our world. Some of those things exist in your life right now. And you know what? God knows what's happening in your life. God hears you when you cry out to him. And he says to you, I understand. I see what is happening to you. I hear you. I love you. I want you to put your faith in me and understand that I'm walking with you. He says, can you hear me? Can you pause long enough in the midst of your pain and turmoil to listen to what God wants to say to you today?